My name is Davis Black, and they often say that blood is thicker than water, but what they forget to mention is that blood is also a lot easier to spill and far more expensive to clean up once the glass shatters. For 34 years, I lived under the suffocatingly warm blanket of the Blackwood family legacy, believing I was the favored son, the golden child who had successfully steered our ancestral shipping empire through the choppy waters of the modern recession, only to realize on one cold, rain-slicked Tuesday in November that I wasn't the captain of the ship, but merely the ballast meant to be thrown overboard the moment the storm got too heavy. The air in my father's study always smelled of expensive mahogany, aged scotch, and the kind of old-money secrets that stay buried for generations. And as I stood outside the heavy oak doors that evening, intended to surprise them with news of our latest merger, the muffled voices from within froze the very marrow in my bones. It wasn't the sound of my father, Alistair, or my younger brother, Julian, that stopped me, but the clinical, icy tone of my mother, Eleanor, the woman I had worshipped as a saint, as she calmly explained to our family attorney that the legal framework for the restructuring was complete, ensuring that when the federal audit inevitably uncovered the decade-long embezzlement scheme Julian had initiated, every single digital fingerprint and paper trail would lead directly and exclusively to my desk. I stood there, the heavy brass handle cold against my palm, listening to my own flesh and blood discuss my incarceration as if they were debating which vintage of wine to serve at dinner, hearing Julian chuckle about how good old reliable Davis would never even look at the fine print because he trusted the family too much to ever suspect a knife in his ribs. The suspense of that moment was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure in my chest as I realized that every hug, "We're so proud of you, Davis," and every Sunday roast had been a carefully choreographed performance designed to keep the sacrificial lamb fattened and unsuspecting. I didn't burst in. Instead, I retreated into the shadows of the hallway, my mind racing through the last 10 years, replaying every document I'd signed on faith, every late night I'd worked to cover Julian's errors, and every time my father had patted my back while secretly eyeing the distance to the edge of the cliff he was preparing to push me over. The moral weight of their betrayal felt like a lead shroud, stripping away the person I thought I was and replacing him with a ghost, a realization that I had spent my entire adult life building a fortress for people who were simultaneously digging a dungeon underneath it for me. I spent the next 6 hours in the dark of my own office, not crying, because tears are for those who still have something left to lose, but meticulously deconstructing the web they had woven, discovering that the family trust I thought I was managing was actually a hollowed-out shell, and that my parents had already moved the bulk of the assets to offshore accounts in Julian's name, leaving me with nothing but the legal liability of a sinking empire. The emotional vacuum of that night changed me, turning the warmth of my memories into ash, as I watched the digital clocks flicker toward midnight, realizing that the people who gave me life were now the very people trying to steal it from me to protect their own comfort and Julian's reckless incompetence. I understood then that family is often just a polite word for a predatory pact, a realization that forced me to choose between a misplaced sense of loyalty and my own survival, ultimately leading me to realize that the only way to win a game where the deck is stacked against you is to burn the entire table down. By dawn, I had compiled the true evidence of Julian's crimes and my father's oversight, not to save the company, but to ensure that when the ship went down, I wouldn't be the only one drowning. And as I walked out of that house for the last time, leaving the keys on the marble foyer, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of liberation. I walked into the gray morning light of London, a man with no family and a name that was about to be dragged through the mud. Yet I felt lighter than I had in decades because I finally knew the truth, that I was never truly one of them, and that was the greatest gift they had ever unintentionally given me. The lesson I carry now, as I sit in this quiet apartment across the ocean, is that your real family isn't the one you're born into, but the one you earn through mutual respect and honesty, and that sometimes the most moral thing you can do is walk away from the people who claim to love you while they're sharpening the blade for your back. My name is Davis Black, and that was the day I realized that while blood may be thick, it is also incredibly easy to wash away if you have enough courage to walk through the rain. The silence that followed my departure was more deafening than any shouting match could have been, a cold, ringing vacuum that filled my lungs as I vanished into the anonymity of the London fog, knowing that the man who walked into that house was dead, and the man who walked out was a ghost with a vendetta. For the first 48 hours, I lived out of a nondescript hotel in Canary Wharf, my laptop screen the only source of light as I meticulously dismantled the Blackwood myth. Watching through remote access as my father and Julian realized the bird had not only flown the coop but had taken the keys to the golden cage with him. The suspense of waiting for that first phone call was a slow-acting poison, and when it finally came, my father's voice sounding not like a parent, but like a desperate predator losing its grip on its prey, I didn't offer him the comfort of an explanation, but simply told him that the Davis he could manipulate had been buried in the garden of our estate. I spent the next 3 months playing a high-stakes game of psychological chess across the Atlantic, moving from London to a quiet, rain-swept corner of Seattle to further distance myself from their reach, all while feeding the federal investigators just enough breadcrumbs to keep them hungry but not enough to let them close the case until I had moved every cent of my own legitimate earnings into untouchable trusts. The emotional toll was a heavy, constant ache in my chest, especially when my mother sent a series of handwritten letters, not of apology, but of manipulation, pleading for family unity, while her lawyers were simultaneously trying to freeze my bank accounts and paint me as a mentally unstable whistleblower. It was a masterclass in betrayal to watch Eleanor Blackwood, the woman who had tucked me in for 1,000 nights, testify in a deposition that I had always been troubled and prone to delusions of grandeur. A calculated move to discredit the evidence I held against Julian. The moral crossroads I faced was harrowing. I could have stayed silent and taken the fall to keep the family name pure, or I could burn the lineage to the ground to save my own soul, and every time I looked at the digital trail of how they had systematically replaced my signature on forged documents, the fire in my gut grew hotter. The climax came on a Tuesday, the same day of the week my world had collapsed. When the news broke that Julian had been taken into custody at Heathrow, and my father's resignation was being framed as a health crisis, though the world knew it was the stench of the Blackwood scandal that was truly killing him. Sitting in a small cafe 3,000 miles away, watching the downfall of my own blood on a muted television screen, I felt no joy, only a hollow, echoing relief, as I realized that the family I had fought to protect was nothing more than a collection of strangers who happened to share my DNA. The suspense of the legal battles eventually faded into the background noise of my new life, replaced by a quiet, solitary existence where I no longer had to look over my shoulder at the people who were supposed to be guarding my back. I am Davis Black, and as I reflect on the ruins of that empire, I see that the true moral of my story isn't about the money I lost or the status I gave up, but about the terrifying, beautiful moment when you realize that being alone is infinitely better than being surrounded by people who only love the version of you they can use. I've built a new life now, one where my name belongs only to me, and while the scars of that betrayal are carved deep into my character, they serve as a constant reminder that the only person you truly have to answer to at the end of the day is the one looking back at you in the mirror. My family thought they were burying me when they tried to frame me, but they forgot that I was the one who taught them how to dig, and in the end, the only people left in the hole were the ones who thought they were holding the shovel. The fallout wasn't merely a headline that faded with the morning news. It was a slow, agonizing demolition of a dynasty that I had to watch from the front row of a cold, mahogany-clad courtroom in the Old Bailey, because as it turned out, the authorities wouldn't let me just walk away. They needed the ghost to testify against the gods. Returning to London felt like walking back into a graveyard where the bodies weren't quite dead yet, and as I sat in that witness box, the air thick with the scent of floor wax and ancient secrets, I had to stare directly into my mother's eyes. Eyes that didn't hold a shred of remorse, only a calculated, simmering rage that I had dared to survive her design. The suspense of those weeks was a suffocating shroud. Every time the defense attorney, a man my father had paid a small fortune to dismantle my character, stood up to speak, he didn't just ask questions. He threw daggers at the very foundation of my childhood, trying to prove that I was the mastermind and Julian was the victim of my superior intellect and manipulative nature. It was a surreal, sickening experience to hear my own life story rewritten by the people who had shared my dinner table, as they presented forged journals and witnesses from our past who had been bought off to say that I had always been the black sheep, the one with the criminal mind, while Julian was the innocent heir led astray. But they had underestimated one thing. A man who has already lost his soul to betrayal has nothing left to fear, and I had spent my months in Seattle not just hiding, but digitizing every scrap of evidence, every late-night recording I had secretly made after that fateful night at the study door, and every offshore routing number that my father thought was untraceable. The moral weight of the moment I released the Blackwood ledger. the true record of their crimes, felt like a physical shift in the earth's gravity. And as the courtroom fell into a stunned, tomb-like silence, I watched the mask finally slip from my mother's face, revealing a hollow, terrifying void where a heart should have been. I realized then that my family wasn't just not on my side. They were a different species entirely, a pack of predators who viewed love as a currency and loyalty as a weakness to be exploited until the bank ran dry. The trial ended not with a bang, but with a whimper of broken men and a woman who refused to look at the wreckage she had caused. And as Julian was led away in handcuffs, screaming that I had stolen his life, I felt a chilling sense of irony because he had never actually lived. He had only existed as a parasite on the efforts I had poured into that company. My father didn't survive the shame, or perhaps he just couldn't live in a world where he wasn't the master of the board. And when the news of his sudden heart failure reached me in my small, lonely flat, I didn't feel the grief of a son, but the cold finality of a chapter closing on a book I never wanted to read. I am Davis Black, and people often ask me how I could do it, how I could be the one to put my own brother behind bars and leave my mother to rot in the ruins of her social standing. And my answer is always the same. They chose the game. I just decided to stop playing by their rules. The moral cost of my freedom was the total annihilation of my past, leaving me a man with a heavy bank account but a name that carries the stench of scandal across 2 continents. A man who knows that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones under your bed, but the ones who tuck you into it and kiss your forehead while planning your demise. I spend my days now traveling through the gray, misty landscapes of Scotland and the rugged coasts of Maine, never staying in one place long enough to let anyone get close, because once you've seen the people you love most sharpen the blade for your throat, you never quite stop looking for the glint of steel in every smile. The story of the Blackwoods is a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition replaces affection. And as I sit here today, a ghost among the living, I realize that the day I lost my family was the day I finally found my humanity, even if it's a humanity that is scarred, cynical, and perpetually alone. I've learned that the true measure of a person isn't found in their bloodline, but in their willingness to stand in the truth when the lie is more comfortable. And though my name is Davis Black, the black no longer stands for the family I lost, but for the dark, quiet peace I've found in the aftermath of their betrayal. If you ever find yourself standing outside a door, hearing the people you love planning your destruction, don't scream, don't cry, and don't beg. Just remember my name, remember what I did, and realize that the only way to truly survive a family like mine is to become the one thing they never expected. A man who doesn't need them to exist. The aftermath of the trial was not the clean break I had envisioned, but rather a slow, toxic evaporation of everything I had once considered concrete, leaving me to wander through a world that felt increasingly like a stage set where the actors had all fled, leaving only the hollow echoes of their lies behind. My existence became a series of quiet, deliberate movements designed to erase the footprint of Davis Black from the social registries of London and the financial ledgers of the world. Yet the more I tried to disappear, the more the ghost of my family's treachery seemed to follow me in the way people looked at me, with a mixture of pity for the betrayed son, and a lingering suspicion that perhaps I was just the most clever villain of the lot. A year after the gates of the prison slammed shut on Julian and the earth settled over my father's grave, I found myself standing before the grim, gray walls of Holloway Prison, driven by a masochistic need to see the woman who had orchestrated my downfall and find out if there was even a flicker of a mother left beneath the ice of Eleanor Blackwood. The visiting room was a claustrophobic box of shattered dreams and recycled air, and when she was finally let in, stripped of her designer silks and replaced by the drab, utilitarian uniform of an inmate, she didn't look like a broken woman. She looked like a fallen queen who still expected the guards to bow. Our eyes met through the reinforced glass, and the silence between us was a physical weight, 1,000 unsaid apologies and 1,000,000 more justifications hanging in the air like smoke in a room with no windows. I didn't pick up the phone to hear her voice at first. I just watched her, looking for a sign of the woman who used to read me stories. But all I saw was the cold, calculating strategist who had weighed her eldest son's life against a balance sheet and found me lacking. When I finally pressed the plastic receiver to my ear, her first words weren't, "I'm sorry" or "I miss you," but a sharp, venomous critique of how I had handled the liquidation of the family assets, as if she were still sitting in the boardroom and I were merely a disappointing intern. "You always were too sentimental, Davis," she hissed, her voice a jagged blade of disappointment. "You could have had it all if you had just played your part, but you chose to be the hero of a tragedy that didn't need one. And now look at us. You're a man with no history, and I am a woman with no future. That was the moment the last remaining thread of my old life finally snapped, because I realized that for Eleanor Blackwood, I had never been a son. I had been a project, an asset to be managed, and her only regret wasn't the betrayal, but the fact that I had proven to be a variable she couldn't control. I hung up the phone without saying a word, leaving her mid-sentence. And as I walked out of that prison and into the biting chill of a London autumn, I felt the finality of my isolation settle into my bones like a permanent winter. I spent the next several years drifting through the shadows of Europe, using my portion of the reclaimed fortune not for luxury, but to quietly fund whistleblowers and legal aid for people who had been chewed up by families and corporations just like mine, turning the blood money of the Blackwoods into a shield for the vulnerable. The suspense of my life shifted from fearing the next betrayal to the quiet tension of building something new from the ashes, a slow-motion reconstruction of a soul that had been dismantled by the very people who were supposed to be its architects. My name is Davis Black, and as I sit on a weathered bench overlooking the crashing waves of the Scottish coast today, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I think about Julian sitting in his cell, still convinced he was the victim of my disloyalty. And I think about my mother's cold eyes, and I realize that the most profound moral of my story is that some people are simply incapable of love because they are too busy worshipping the power they think it should bring them. I am 42 years old now, and I have no wife, no children, and no one to carry on a name that I have worked so hard to strip of its infamy. Yet in this solitude, I have found a clarity that the golden boy version of me could never have imagined. I've learned that the true measure of a man's wealth isn't the thickness of his bank account or the prestige of his lineage, but the peace he feels when he is alone in the dark, and for the first time in my life, I don't fear the silence. The realization that my family was never on my side was the most painful experience of my life, a trauma that reshaped my DNA and taught me to trust the wind more than a human promise. But it was also the fire that forged me into a man who is truly, terrifyingly free. I have become a student of the human heart, watching from the sidelines as others navigate the treacherous waters of kinship, and while I sometimes feel a pang of envy for those who have a genuine hearth to return to, I quickly remember the price of admission to the Blackwood table was one's own soul. I am Davis Black, a man who survived the ultimate betrayal by learning that the only side worth being on is your own. And as the stars begin to poke through the velvet sky over the North Sea, I finally forgive myself for the crime of being an innocent child who once believed that blood was a bond that couldn't be broken. The story of my life is no longer a tragedy written by my parents. It is a quiet, ongoing epic written by a man who took the knife out of his back and used it to cut the chains that bound him to a legacy of ghosts. This concludes the epic saga of Davis Black, a man who turned the darkness of betrayal into the light of absolute truth. To hear more stories that uncover the deep, often hidden realities of human bonds and the strength found in honesty, please support the Black Relation channel. On that channel, Black doesn't stand for hate or darkness, but for the raw, unvarnished truth that every relationship needs to survive.